It's Connor in coverage. We're going to be talking about getting the chance to make a second first impression. Hello, everyone, and welcome into another edition of Connor in coverage. My name is Connor Riley. We do this every Sunday night. Obviously, last Sunday night was the Super Bowl, and we decided to take that one off. But we're back here pretty much every Sunday night, unless I'm on vacation from now through the rest of the year, obviously throughout the offseason. And as we learned this week, there is no real offseason when it comes to covering the University of Georgia, as Mike Bobo was hired as the offensive coordinator to replace Todd Monken. Came very quickly. That decision, it was not all that surprising when Monken did ultimately elect to leave for the Baltimore Ravens job. I think people who have watched the show and followed along had kind of come to brace for the fact that I think Monken did want to leave for the NFL. And I think the big question was there going to be a job that offered him, what he was looking for? And I think the big thing there, to be an offensive play caller, to be in a stable environment. The Baltimore Ravens have been that for the better part of the 21st century there. He gets to be the play caller, and whether or not he ultimately gets to work with Lamar Jackson will be decided this offseason. But I do think that Lamar Jackson is probably going to be the Ravens quarterback next season. And so you get a player like that to work with. You have the stability that Ravens franchise has. They made the playoffs this past season. With a few offensive changes and a healthy Lamar Jackson, it's not unrealistic, in my opinion, to possibly expect them to be Super Bowl contenders this coming season. And so you can understand, I think, the rational people among us, why Todd Monken will want to leave to do that. And again, he's always sort of been someone who doesn't want to stick around for a long time, move from job to job. He's only spent 4 years or more in a place once, and that was as the Jaguars wide receiver coach from 2007 to 2010. And the big thing that I've touched on has been sort of my default argument. If I told you at the beginning of this season that Georgia was going to win another national championship and that they were going to have a statistically proven top 5 offense in both points per game and yards per game, they were going to have a Heisman Trophy finalist at the quarterback position, and along with the second best, or in my opinion, the best offensive line in the country, not to mention the best tight end in the country, I think most Georgia fans probably would have understood that, yeah, Todd Monken is going to be looking to be coaching elsewhere in 2023. Just given when you have that kind of success, you don't keep those coaches around that long. Dan Lanning was the architect of a great defense in 2020-21, and that is why he is now the head coach at the University of Oregon. That's just the reality of swimming in these waters of Georgia. And as we saw this past season, well, yes, replacing Lanning is not an easy thing to do. Kirby Smart did a pretty good job of it in promoting Glenn Schumann and bringing in Will Muschamp, a guy he's known for a long time and had a lot of familiarity with. Well, Mike Bobo sort of is the mesh of both of those things. Bobo was on this staff last season working as an analyst. As far as we know, his role was largely in play design, helping Monken script out the start to games, while he was obviously, he being Bobo, not allowed to work hands-on with quarterbacks during drills in terms of running them and leading them. He was an instrumental part of this offense in terms of designing it, in terms of scheming it up, in terms of play calling, in terms of designing things and how things were going to look in that aspect. And so now he's going to take on even bigger responsibilities in 2023. He is going to be the quarterback's coach. He is going to be the offensive coordinator. He's going to be the play caller for this Georgia team. And obviously, Georgia fans know who Mike Bobo is. He was the offensive coordinator here from 2007 through 2014. He also served as the quarterback's coach from 2001 to 2014. And he was not all that popular his first time around in Athens. I was around for the tail end of that tenure. I can very vividly remember my grandmother not being too happy that I was trying to confirm whether or not he would be leaving to take the Colorado State head coaching job over Christmas break in 2014. That is exactly what he ended up doing. He was the head coach there for 5 seasons, going 28-35 there for the Rams out in Fort Collins, Colorado, before in 2020 being the offensive coordinator and interim coach for South Carolina, and then in 2021 being the offensive coordinator at Auburn. Now, the fact that he was only at those schools for 1 year isn't that surprising, because those offenses weren't all that great. But I think the one key thing to remember here with Bobo and his time at both South Carolina and Auburn, those teams were nowhere near as talented as what Georgia has on offense this coming year. We'll get into that here in a little bit, as that's sort of our main topic here for tonight. But 2, the stability around those programs was nothing compared to what Georgia has around it at this point in time. At South Carolina, it was Will Muschamp's last year. There was a lot of talk, is he going to be able to retain this job? Is he going to come back? Ultimately, he gets fired midway through that 2020 season in a pandemic. And Bobo actually ends up being the interim coach to finish things out there in South Carolina. And then at Auburn, look, Brian Harson's tenure was a total disaster, gets fired midway through the second season. The first season didn't help out a whole lot, but it is worth pointing out, if they win that Alabama game at the end of the 2021 season where they were playing with a backup quarterback after Bo Nix got hurt, maybe they win that game, maybe things go differently. But the fact of the matter is they don't go well at Auburn, they don't go well at South Carolina. And so there are naturally a lot of people, scratching their head about this hire. And I'll get into a deeper story on this coming later this week on why the hiring of Bobo is so polarizing. I think most fans have their opinions on it. You can date back to his time originally as a play caller where I think naturally there were some growing pains there. And I think, that happens with every play caller, especially when they're doing it for the first time. I think that's maybe why Kirby Smart wasn't going to go out and hire someone who had never done it before, when the fact of the matter is Georgia's staring down the barrel of winning possibly 3 straight national championships. And this coordinator hire was an important one. And I think Kirby Smart has shown he knows what he's looking for. He knows what he wants in terms of going out and bringing in an offensive mind. And I think he knows what Bobo is capable of doing. And ultimately, there's a big reason why he's back at this program. And I think, look, going forward, you've got Will Muschamp on the defensive side of the ball. You've got Mike Bobo on the offensive side of the ball. Those are going to be guys that keep Kirby happy and at Georgia long term. Those are guys that have head coaching experience. I think that matters. They can help run this program if Kirby wants to, let up some of the reins or some of the responsibilities that he has on a day-to-day basis. I will point out there is one area where Mike Bobo is far and away superior to Todd Monken that comes on the recruiting trail. Todd Monken was not much of a recruiter. He did not want to recruit a whole lot as is. I think the move to the NFL, that lifestyle change, is a big reason why he is going back to the NFL where he was before he came to the University of Georgia, whereas Mike Bobo is an excellent recruiter, has an excellent eye for talent for the most part. I know some people are still upset about the fact that Georgia didn't seriously recruit Deshaun Watson when he was a prospect in 2014, and more people wanted to, see them take them instead of what happened with Bryce Ramsey, who was a 2013 Georgia quarterback recruit, who I believe finished with more career punts than games started. I think, watching how Bobo recruits and elevates and evaluates this quarterback room is certainly going to be something to watch going forward. But Todd Monken is out, Mike Bobo is in, and that's a new system for these Georgia players to learn. And that's sort of our first topic here tonight on what this offense is going to look like going forward, especially given where Mike Bobo has been in the past. And I had a story go up on Friday. You can check it out on DawgNation.com, talking about the past offenses under Mike Bobo and how they statistically compared to what Todd Monken was doing. And there were a couple of really good offenses in there. I think the 2014 one in some areas, you could consider it elite, especially when you factor in the talent level that he was having to work with, the suspension of Todd Gurley during the season. Hudson Mason was the quarterback of that team. I think Georgia's offense next season is far more talented, top to bottom, than what Monken had in 2014, the last time he was the offensive coordinator at Georgia. And the position, we'll start off first because I think this is maybe the easiest one. The running back position at Georgia. You look at guys like Kendall Milton, Dejon Edwards. I think those are going to be your top 2 ball carriers next year. I'm interested in seeing what kind of role Branson Robinson has as he continues to develop as a running back there. Andrew Paul, I expect him to be a limited participant in spring practice as he continues to recover from an ACL injury. You have Roderick Robinson as well, the freshman running back from San Diego. It'll be interesting to see what you see there. But I think with what we've seen in the past out of Bobo and how he wants to run the football and what he wants to get out of his running backs, I think is a good sign. And we'll start at the top with Kendall Milton, who actually finished behind Dejon Edwards in terms of rushing yards per game this past season, in total rushing yards in total. But among qualified running backs, Kendall Milton led the SEC last year in yards per carry at, I believe, 6.96 yards per attempt, had over 100 yards rushing in the win over LSU. A very talented running back. Talent has never been the question for Kendall Milton. It has been his ability to stay on the football field. He had injuries all 3 of his seasons so far at Georgia. But entering his senior year, he's going to be one of the clear leaders on the offensive side of the ball. And I expect Mike Bobo to really like how he's going to be able to use Milton this season. I expect him to see an uptick in touches. One thing for Todd Monken, as much success as he brought to the University of Georgia, none of his three running backs or none of his three seasons saw a running back top 1,000 rushing yards. Zamir White did not do it. James Cook did not do it. Kenny McIntosh did not do it. And that's not a knock against those guys. All three of them are going to be NFL running backs. White and Cook already in the league, and you have Kenny McIntosh, who will be drafted in the 2023 NFL draft. All that talent, it is not the fact that they did not get to the certain statistical benchmark that we had been accustomed to seeing, 1,000 rushing yards from the running back position. I don't think it has anything to do with them. I think it has more to do with how Todd Monken envisioned and wanted to use his running backs. I think Mike Bobo, on the other hand, look, 2012, Todd Gurley, 1,300 rushing yards as a freshman. In 10 games in 2013, he had 989 yards. And if he'd been able to play a fully healthy season, would have had over 1,500 rushing yards. In 2014, Todd Gurley, in I think 7 games, had 919 rushing yards. Obviously, he misses 4 games for the suspension due to the NCAA autograph scandal. And then he tears his ACL against Auburn. Nick Chubb finished with 1,500 rushing yards that season. And even in his 2 seasons at Auburn and South Carolina, where, yes, the overall offensive picture as a whole was not rosy, Kevin Harris ran for 1,000 yards in South Carolina in 10 games in that shortened COVID season. And then you have Tank Bigsby with 1,099 yards in the 2021 season there as well. So running backs have always been statistically very productive under Mike Bobo, especially his last couple years at Georgia and then his recent stops at South Carolina and Auburn. So I think a guy like Kendall Milton could be someone that really explodes, given what you saw from him, sample size this year, and how he really finished the year really strong, in my opinion. Strong performance against Ohio State, had a touchdown against TCU, had touchdowns in both college football playoff games, along with over 100 rushing yards against LSU in the SEC championship game. So I think he's a guy where, if he's able to stay healthy, and that's always been the big thing with Kendall, if he's healthy, he's going to be a guy that I expect to top 1,000 rushing yards next season. Expect Daijun Edwards to also be a very important figure in that running back room last year. I think the biggest thing that they're going to have to replace at the running back position is the pass production that Kenny McIntosh brought. He had 43 receptions this past season. The 4 players coming back have a combined 25 receptions in their career. So the running back's ability to pass catch out of the backfield, that's been an important trademark in recent years. DeAndre Swift excelled at that. James Cook did as well. It's sort of an unknown for Georgia entering the 2023 season, and it's going to be up to Mike Bobo to see if that is going to continue to be an important part of this passing offense. I think the next place that I would think would be an easy place to start is the quarterback position. And my understanding, and look, we talked with Stetson about this a good bit, and yes, Todd Monken is an excellent play designer. He is a clearly gifted offensive mind. He did not mesh very well with Stetson Bennett at times. Those two guys butted heads. Stetson was quick to point out the role that Buster Faulkner, who is now the offensive coordinator at Georgia Tech, played in sort of helping Stetson grow and develop in those areas. And it's worth pointing out, Todd Monken, for much of his career, has been involved with the wide receivers and has been a wide receiver guru or a wide receiver coach. That has been his number one position. And so I think getting to work with a guy like Mike Bobo, who has a lot of experience with this quarterback position and has developed guys throughout his first stint at Georgia when he was the quarterback's coach. David Green, very successful. DJ Shockley, Matt Stafford, Aaron Murray. Developing and identifying those guys. Now, at the end, yes, you didn't necessarily want Hudson Mason to be your quarterback, and the quarterback room was in a very bad spot when Bobo left after the 2014 season. And in 2015, you saw that play out. Grayson Lambert starting, Faton Bauta starting the doomed Florida game there in 2015. He did recruit Jacob Eason and got him here, and he was a big part early of Georgia's time in the Kirby Smart era there. Bobo is going to help these quarterbacks and relate to them in a way I think Todd Monken at times struggled to. And that, that's not a knock against Monken. He just comes from a very different background in the NFL structure and system and is a little bit more blunt with the way he coaches, whereas Bobo is a different kind of coach. And so I do think these quarterbacks are going to have a more hands-on approach, and that's going to help a guy like Carson Beck. I think one guy in particular, Gunnar Stockton, has a long history with the Bobo family. Gunnar Stockton originally committed to South Carolina when Mike Bobo was the offensive coordinator there. And while I don't right now expect Gunnar Stockton to be the starting quarterback for Georgia in 2023, I think right now, February 19th, I still think that guy is going to be Carson Beck. I think long-term, Gunnar's going to be a guy that sticks around this program. And I think Gunnar Stockton is a guy who's going to work very well with Mike Bobo going into the future, whenever that ultimately might come to be. But I think he's a guy, given the history that he has with Bobo, the familiarity and trust with Bobo, I think that's going to be a very positive sign for the development of Gunnar Stockton in terms of where things go going forward with him and his career at the University of Georgia. And there are obviously going to be a lot of eyes on that quarterback room, that quarterback position going into spring practice. I don't expect them to name a starter. I would think that they're going to pull this competition even into the season, given how easy the start of the 2023 campaign is for Georgia, not leaving Sanford Stadium until the 5th game of the year at Auburn. You want to have 3 scholarship quarterbacks. That way you're able to run them the way you can if need be. I thought Stetson's legs were a huge part of this Georgia offense last season. He had 10 rushing touchdowns. And you look back at that 2019 team before Monken got here, when Georgia only had 2 scholarship quarterbacks in Jake Fromm and Stetson Bennett, who at that point was a massive unknown. Dwan Mathis was expected to be the 3rd quarterback there. He unfortunately has the brain surgery that knocked him out for that season. So you have that sort of, luxury of having 3 quarterbacks, and you can move a guy like Carson Beck around, who is not the runner that Stetson Bennett is, but I do think is a capable guy with his legs who can pick up a first down if need be and move things around. And then obviously Brock Vandergriff and Gunnar Stockton, I think, are much more comfortable and much bigger weapons as runners. And so it'll be interesting to see how Georgia chooses to use that going forward, and how a quarterback's mobility is used. I think that's one of the areas where it has really changed from when Bobo was last here to now. You have to have something out of that QB run, or get some running attribute out of your quarterback from a rushing standpoint. And so, Bo Nix was able to do that a little bit at South Carolina when he had Luke Doty. I think that was a big part of the Mike Bobo offense there. So I expect going forward them to still strategically use quarterback run under Mike Bobo's offense. Maybe not as much as Todd Monken's, but that might be a more personnel-driven thing than a strategic standpoint thought there. And then one other guy, and yes, I think the big thing to watch here, Brock Bowers is still, I expect, to lead Georgia in receiving next season. I think he is one of, if not the most talented players in college football next year. I think he has a chance to rewrite some Georgia records. Through the first 2 seasons, no pass catcher has been statistically more productive in his Georgia career than Brock Bowers, and I think he's got a chance to go down as an all-time great in the University of Georgia, if he's not already there. 2 years, 2 national championships, 2-time All-American, Mackey Award winner this past season, a true stud. But a guy in this offense who I'm really interested in seeing how he develops and how he continues to make strides is Marcus Rosemy-Jacksaint. You look back in that 2014, or not necessarily 2014, but those Bobo offenses, they always had a guy on the outside who could go up and make big catches. Wasn't necessarily the fastest guy in the world, but was a very strong, all-around, overall good wide receiver. Malcolm Mitchell comes to mind. Tavares King comes to mind. I mean, A.J. Green is obviously the archetype, the probably the best receiver to ever play for the University of Georgia. He recently retired from the NFL. But Mike Bobo's offenses at Georgia in the past always had strong outside wide receiver play. And I think if you're going to see that on this team this coming season, a guy that might really benefit there is Marcus Rosemy-Jacksaint. I think Ladd McConkey is a guy who's also going to play a little bit more on the outside this season. I think that's why they go out, they bring in Dominic Lovett. I think he's going to be your number 1 option in the slot position. You've also got Arian Smith there as well. And on the outside, a guy like Marcus Rosemy-Jacksaint, who we already know, he does everything right. He blocks well. He's a leader on this team, a very well-respected veteran going into his 4th year in the program, and made some big plays over the course of this past season. Had a touchdown catch against Tennessee, had a touchdown catch to really get things going against Georgia Tech, had a big 3rd down catch in the win over Ohio State. He is a guy who, again, not a burner, but a guy who can make tight contested catches, and I think a guy that is going to mesh very well potentially with Carson Beck's skill set going into the 2023 season. So 3 names to sort of sum all this up of guys that I think are really going to benefit from the scheme change and the position change of going from a Todd Monken offense to a Mike Bobo offense. At running back, I think it's Kendall Milton. I think this guy, again, if he can stay healthy, can have a really, really big and positive impact for Georgia, given the way that Mike Bobo has used running backs in the past. I think Gunnar Stockton is a big name to know and keep an eye on. Again, I don't expect him to be the starting quarterback this year, but he really impressed a lot of people in his first year at Georgia. And I think with the fact that he's going to continue to work with Mike Bobo, there's a strong connection there. I think Gunnar Stockton is someone you would want to, and I apologize for this pun here, but buy stock in going forward in terms of what he's going to be in this Georgia offense. And then number 3, Marcus Rosemy-Jacksain. I think he's a guy who's improved every year since that ankle injury. Is a guy that Georgia and Kirby Smart in particular really trust in this offense. And I think with what we've seen from Mike Bobo in the outside wide receiver position in the past, I think he can be a guy that really ups his production. I'm not saying he's going to be a 1,000-yard receiver because Georgia only had one of those in program history, but could he be a guy that I think this past season he had roughly around 350 yards receiving? Could he get that up to say 600-700 range? And I think really make an impression on this Georgia passing offense there. So talking a little bit about the guys who stand to benefit from what Mike Bobo is going to bring to this offense. And the big things that I've heard so far is this isn't going to be an offense that changes all that much. I don't expect the verbiage and the terminology to change a whole lot. I think structurally or schematically, it's still going to be an offense predicated on getting the ball to the best athletes in space. This isn't a Josh Heupel type offense where they run a very set scheme and do things a very certain way. They're going to change and adapt to whatever their personnel is. When you have guys like Brock Bowers and Ladd McConkey who are mismatches and can really dominate in the middle of the field, you're still going to have that and still attack that there. The quarterback run this year might not be as important as it was a season ago, in part because I think that's just part of the change in going from Stetson Bennett to potentially Carson Beck. But there are going to be other areas that I think things change this year. I think it's going to be a little bit more wide receiver heavy, just given they're in a better spot depth-wise at that position. And, well, yes, Oscar Delp is a player I'm excited to see and eager to see how he grows and develops. He's not Darnell Washington, and he's cut, I think, a little bit more like Brock Bowers. And so the 2 tight end sets that Georgia very comfortably ran last season, I think you're going to see that shift a little bit more into 3 wide receiver looks more often than not entering this upcoming season. So I think that's something to sort of watch there going forward as well in terms of how the offense makes some small tweaks. And that's not necessarily going to be on Mike Bobo. That's just going to be on how Georgia chooses always to run this offense in terms of matching your best players to what you ultimately want to run going forward there. We're going to touch a little bit on the defensive line, but we can save that for another time. Let's go ahead and open up to your comments and questions, thoughts you guys might have. Obviously, big news of the week. Mike Bobo is now Georgia's offensive coordinator, and I'm sure as I pull up the chat here, there are tons of rational opinions about this, as he seems to be a polarizing figure when it comes to this. Let's see. Thoughts, comments, questions. Let's see. Yeah, Keith Ritchie, they're not overhauling the offense here. And I think, the continuity at this point in time was a big reason why. Monken and Bobo worked very closely together this past season, and I think that matters. Whereas when Kirby brought in Monken to replace James Coley back in 2020, at that point in time, the offense did need an overhauling. James Coley really struggled in his 1 year as the offensive coordinator there, and it was time to move on and make changes. And so, again, Georgia's in a very different place now than when it hired Todd Monken. Todd Monken deserves credit for that. He left Georgia in a much better place than when he found it. And so now Kirby doesn't need to go out there and reinvent the wheel once again. He knows what works, and especially because there are a lot of pieces that return from this offense that was so successful a year ago. Yes, you have to replace Stetson Bennett. You have to replace your 2 starting tackles in Warren McClendon and Broderick Jones. You do have to replace Darnell Washington, who I think was an instrumental part of what Georgia was able to do a season ago. But you do bring back a lot of your running back talent. You bring back most of your wide receiver talent. You bring back Brock Bowers, who's maybe the best player in college football, not to mention Ladd McConkey, your second leading receiver last season. There's a lot coming back. So I think in Kirby making the hire that he did is a sign that I'm not going to structurally change my offense all that much. I don't believe what we do here at Georgia needs to be overhauled schematically. And that's why I think the big reason why they ultimately elevate Mike Bobo there. Let's see. Thoughts, comments. Andrew, this is a really good point that he brings up on YouTube. This Georgia offense is more talented than whatever Mike Bobo has ever, in my opinion, had to work with. Maybe the 2007 offense, his first year at the University of Georgia. But I think from a raw talent standpoint, this is easily the most talented offensive line that he's ever gotten to work with. That 2014 offensive line had really only 2 NFL players, John Theus, who was a 5th-round pick, and David Andrews, who was an undrafted free agent. Now, those guys are both really good college players, but Cedric Von Prawn, Tate Ratledge, Amarius Mims, I think those are all Sunday players. Xavier Truss, I would mention him as well. as a Sunday guy. And look, they've got a lot of bodies to throw at that left tackle position to figure out ultimately who that is going to be. So I think that is absolutely something to watch going forward. Let's see. Thoughts, comments. Let's see. Yeah, JC, I'd probably agree with this. Obviously injuries play a factor every year, but Georgia, I think, does a really good job of limiting those and not, because they play so many guys and also because they get up so big in games early, they don't necessarily have the wear and tear on tires at the end of the year. Like, for example, you saw, I think, with Jamison Williams and John Mechie at the end of the 2021 season, those guys, yes, they go down with ACL injuries, but part of that too, Alabama was very reliant on those guys and put a lot of miles on them over the course of the season. So Georgia's schedule, look, it's real easy. There's no sugarcoating this. Maybe Auburn makes impressive strides under Hugh Freeze right away, but I still don't trust what they have at the quarterback position. It looks like right now they're still rolling with Robbie Ashford. I don't trust what he can do throwing the football to win. They have to replace Tank Bigsby there. I think, at Tennessee is probably your toughest regular season game, and going to Neyland, that's going to be tough. They do have to replace Hendon Hooker, who's a very good player for them. We'll see if Joe Milton ultimately turns it around. He's been named a starter at Michigan. He's been named a starter at Tennessee before and wasn't able to hold on to either of those jobs. And Tennessee does have a talented freshman in Nico Amaliva. And so that is going to make things very interesting there. And look, if they're 12-0 going into the SEC championship game, I think the West is going to be improved this year. I expect A&M to take a step forward. I think LSU is going to get better. We'll see what Alabama does. Nick Saban is obviously still an incredible college football coach. They have a ton of talent. They have signed really good recruiting classes of late, but Alabama played 5 one-score games a season ago. They've got a ton of holes to replace on the defensive side of the ball, especially in the secondary there. Will Anderson as well, and the defensive front is gone. And, ultimately, who's going to be the quarterback? Is it going to be Ty Simpson? Is it going to be Jalen Milroe? What does this offense look like? Because this offense last year was a lot of, Bryce Young and Jahmyr Gibbs, can you help us out and make a play here in this situation? For the most part, they did. But in games against LSU and Tennessee late, they just couldn't quite do it. And so, again, one other thing, on the coordinator change they made, they bring in Tommy Rees on the offensive side of the ball, Kevin Steele on the defensive side of the ball. And Alabama's 2 losses last year, they scored 31 points against LSU, and they scored 49 against Tennessee. Usually under Alabama in the past, that's been enough to win, and that just wasn't the case last year there. But regardless, I think Georgia's a team that is absolutely going to be in a position to be in the college football playoff once again. As we saw, when you get down to that point, you're going to have to win a close game against an elite team, whether it be Ohio State, maybe USC finally decides it's time to play defense, though I don't necessarily believe that based on what we've seen from Lincoln Riley so far. Michigan, maybe they can stop tripping over themselves in the college football playoff semifinal, but I still don't necessarily know about that there. There's a lot of talent out there, and Georgia, Ohio State, or Alabama, you're probably going to have to beat one of Ohio State or Alabama to win a national championship. Bulldogs have been able to do that in the past 2 seasons, and that's why they've won 2 straight national titles. Let's see. John Burroughs. There have been a few analysts who elect to leave and go elsewhere. Eddie Gordon, a guy that was really important in that offensive line room. He is now the offensive line coach at UAB. Robert Muschamp, who was a defensive quality control coach, is now with the Los Angeles Chargers. But in terms of on-field assistants, Todd Monken is the only guy that Georgia has had to replace. And one sort of interesting little nugget here about Georgia on the offensive side of the ball, all 5 of their position coaches on that side of the ball, Mike Bobo, quarterbacks coach, offensive coordinator, Del McGee, running backs coach, wide receivers coach Brian McClendon, tight ends coach Todd Hartley, and offensive line coach Stacey Searles all played high school football in the state of Georgia. They all have strong ties to the state of Georgia, and that is something that is very I think important going forward to this Georgia staff is leaning more and more on those Georgia ties. I know there's a social media clip out there floating around. Kirby Smart pointing out 14 of the 22 starters in the national championship game came from the state of Georgia. And so having that sort of connection on the offensive side of the ball, I think is very important for this program going forward. Jerry Dogs fan, this is a good point as well. I think for the most part, Georgia, certainly on a year in, year out basis, Mike Bobo has not had the ability to work with a defense as talented as what he will at Georgia in this current iteration. There were some good ones. I think the 2012 defense led by Jarvis Jones was a really talented one with a lot of good players. Sean Williams, Alec Ogletree, guys that enjoyed successful NFL careers. But on a year in, year out basis, this is far and away the best defense that Mike Bobo will ever get to work with. And again, you hear Kirby Smart speak so much about playing complementary football and the role that plays and what Georgia ultimately wants to do. I do think going forward, that's going to make things a little bit easier for Mike Bobo. Obviously, whoever was replacing Todd Monken was going to be stepping into very large shoes, and things were going to be very difficult for who ultimately ever is that next offensive coordinator. So the fact that it's Bobo, a guy who understands what it is like to be an offensive coordinator and play caller at the University of Georgia and is more than comfortable with being second guessed and, quite frankly, used to some of the criticisms that come with being a play caller at a job like this, I think made him an even more appealing option as the offensive coordinator here. Because, again, I think, one, this is a hire that is more important and beneficial for Kirby Smart long-term than it necessarily is short-term. But you don't need to reinvent the wheel or upset the apple cart here or disrupt or do anything like that. This is a team trying to win its third straight national title. And look, Georgia's had one-and-done coaches before. James Coley was a one-and-done offensive coordinator. Jamil Adai was a one-and-done cornerbacks and defensive backs coach. If Kirby Smart believes that you're not getting it done as a position coach, he has shown that he will not hesitate to move on from you after just one season. I know that, Smart and Bobo have a long history. They were teammates. They were roommates together. A lot of respect throughout their coaching careers. But if Kirby Smart believes that Mike Bobo is no longer the guy to be the offensive coordinator going forward, I don't believe he'll hesitate in the slightest to move on from him. And I think he knows that. I think he understood that when he made this hire. And that's why I think going forward, Mike Bobo is going to be the guy at Georgia, I think, for quite some time. And I think he's going to be a very successful offensive coordinator in this offense. This is an easy one. We touched on this earlier, Andrew, talking about Kendall Milton. I think you're going to see a 1,000-yard rusher. I'll be interested to see if Brock Bowers can cross that 1,000-yard threshold. AJ Green probably would have done it in 2010 had he not been suspended. But I think consistently throughout the tenure of Mike Bobo offenses, you've seen guys get to 1,000 yards on the ground. And I think next year, I think if Kendall Milton is able to stay healthy throughout the season, I think he's absolutely a guy that can get to that mark. I think Brock Bowers can as well. But we'll see how hesitant Georgia is to throw to him. Obviously, I think everyone saw in the TCU game, if Georgia wants to funnel the ball to Brock Bowers and feed him stats, they can absolutely do that. He had 152 receiving yards one drive into the second quarter. But Georgia knows they need to get Brock and have Brock Bowers healthy through the end of the season. And if you're racking up big numbers against South Carolina and Kentucky and Vanderbilt, and you're putting the wear and tear and tires on him in those games, that affects his availability at the end of the season. And so that's maybe why you don't necessarily see Brock Bowers get to 1,000 yards. But if there is a pass catcher on this team this year that I think could do it, it would be Brock Bowers. We'll maybe do one or two more questions to get out of here. You guys have been great tonight. Bama brings up Brock Bowers is the best athlete out of the quarterbacks. He can run and throw. I would agree with that. That's why he has, I think, the highest upside. But I think all these guys are really talented. I think right now, Carson Beck, I think, clearly has the most talented arm in terms of accuracy and throw power, distance, velocity, whatever term you want to use there. I think he's got the best arm of the bunch. I think Gunnar Stockton is a guy who runs similar style to Tim Tebow, obviously not quite as big as Tim Tebow, but a guy who I think could be a very successful college quarterback and has an arm that is better than I think he gets credit for. And the one thing we already know about Gunnar Stockton is he's an absolute gamer. You heard Kirby Smart talk this year about before or after the TCU game, talking about how Gunnar Stockton said the week of that game, hey, take my black jersey off. If these guys want to hit me and simulate what it's going to be like to go after Max Duggan and that'll help him, I'll do it. I'll take the punishment. And I think going forward, the hire of Mike Bobo, I think has only further reestablished this. But Gunnar Stockton is going to be a name to know at this quarterback position for Georgia going forward and is a guy that is going to be a huge part of this program in years to come. Let's see. We'll maybe do one more question. If there's not, we could also just call it here. One thing on Carson Beck, while I think we all expect him to be the starter, he was the number 2 quarterback going into the 2021 season. And when JT Daniels went down with that injury after the Clemson game, I think everyone expected Carson to be the starter, and maybe Carson did too, but Georgia made it an open competition, and Stetson outperformed Carson. And that wasn't just true in practice. That was true in games as well, because they played him in a game against UAB, and Stetson Bennett just looked a whole lot better than Carson Beck did in that game. And so, yes, it's Carson's to lose, and I don't expect him to lose it, but we have seen that happen before. And look, Brock Vandegrift and Carson and Gunnar Stockton are just as hardworking as Carson Beck. And while Carson knows the opportunity in front of him, I think Georgia knows as well what it can ultimately do and where it ultimately wants to go going forward. And so with Carson Beck, he's got to win this job this offseason. Yes, he's the presumed favorite, but to me, it's not just him not losing the job, and I understand that sentiment, and that's probably where it is right now. The Georgia coaches want to see him go out there and win it, and see that not only because of the experience, because of what we've seen from him already, he's the best quarterback, because this offseason he went out there and earned it and practiced and repped like the starting quarterback. And I do ultimately expect that to be the case for Georgia this offseason, and I expect Georgia to start Carson Beck against UT Martin to open the season. I think Carson, when I talked to him after the national championship game, he knew what he was getting into and knew the statement that he had to make this offseason. And so ultimately, I do expect that to be the case. So that'll be it here for me tonight, talking obviously about the big news of the week, Mike Bobo, what it means from all angles. You'll have Mike Griffith tomorrow night discussing probably the same thing as well, maybe a little bit of an NFL draft preview as he's getting ready to head up to the combine, not this coming week, but next week up there in Indianapolis. Obviously, Brandon Adams is on vacation this week, taking some much-needed time off, but he's got shows banked throughout this week. We get into some interesting discussions in terms of some Georgia Mount Rushmore guys, ultimately where we think things are going forward, players to replace from this past team. You have Jeff Sintel providing recruiting updates as well. Deuce Robinson, some rumblings out there from California, as well as I think the impact that Mike Bobo is going to have as a recruiter on this staff going forward. And one thing on Bobo's recruiting chops and ability, you look at this Georgia class in 2024, it's got a chance to be the number 1 class in the country. I think Mike Bobo is going to play a big factor in ultimately that coming to fruition, as his ability to recruit the state of Georgia, which is loaded in a way it was not last season and last cycle. I think Mike Bobo's recruiting chops are going to make that a big plus for Georgia going forward in terms of its ability to recruit not just the state of Georgia, but on that offensive side of the ball as well. Because while Georgia, I think, has done a really, really good job recruiting on the defensive side in these past 2 cycles, you would like to see maybe a little bit more on the offensive side of the ball. So that'll do it for us here tonight on Connor in Coverage. My name is Connor Riley. We'll be back here next Sunday talking. I'm sure there'll be some form of news this week regarding whatever it ultimately might be, but we'll be back here talking about it all. So thank you guys so much for tuning in. My name is Connor Riley. This has been Connor in Coverage.